Good evening to all our audience in India. Good evening, good afternoon to all us, all those who are tuning in from Europe and UK. And a very good morning to all our, listeners who've tuned in from the United States, northern part of America, southern part of America for that matter. Session 5 is on the meta-turn in law, globalization of law and the rising relevance of legal studies. And our interventionists or panelists, as we might want to call, are across borders. We have Professor Marc L. Miller, Dean James E. Rogers College of Law, University of Arizona, United States of America. We have Professor Bhavani Prasad Panda, Director, Kalinga Institute of Industrial Technology, India. And we will soon be joined by Professor Patricia Roberts, who is Dean, School of Law, St. Mary's University, United States of America. So if you're looking at the theme of the session itself, the theme is largely looking at the relevance of legal studies in the current era of globalization. One would say after globalization, knowledge kind of began to be rediscovered as many, if not all, disciplinary walls have fallen. Studies, became the new approach to rediscover and reorganize knowledge. Many knowledge systems that previously reveled in the glories of their own disciplines, rearranged, reorganized themselves as studies like political studies, cultural studies, management studies, and legal studies for that matter. Their approaches shifted from being ways and means of addressing social issues to thoughts about the foundations of their own knowledge. And so did it happen with law as well. So in law, this movement has prompted the move towards legal studies. As law began to experience a loss at multiple levels, loss of coherence, determinacy, and legitimacy, there was a return to the foundations, a walk around things about law. Legal studies actually facilitated this return and rebuilding to the foundations of the knowledge. And the theme emphasizes and focuses on this particular aspect. So we will, our panelists will address questions in and around this particular theme. So to begin with, my first question to both Marc and Professor Panda is, legal studies have existed even before globalization as a branch of inquiry about law, legal thought, and legal institutions. However, globalization has led to a desperate turn to legal studies in search of foundations of law. How would you like to differentiate between the epistemology of legal studies prior to and after globalization? Professor Miller, if you would want to kind of intervene.
Sure, I'd be happy to start. Thank you, as always, for hosting another spectacular workshop. Jindal has become widely known around the world for the quality and breadth of these gatherings. It's illustrated today. Professor Panda, it's a delight to be on a panel with you. So one of the useful things to start out might be to remind viewers, especially in India, about the difference in legal education in the US, because that difference then defines the role of legal studies as well as the impact of globalization. So the US has been an outlier here, as in some other areas, because for more than 100 years, that decision was made, and we could talk about its historic roots, to treat law as a professional graduate level of education, not undergraduate. And this distinguished us from pretty much everyone in the world. A few footnotes about Australia now and again and South Korea. But, in general, law has been understood to be to the extent formal study was the foundation for legal practice, was understood to be an undergraduate degree. What that means is in the US, before the turn to legalization, when we talked about legal studies or pre-legal studies, we were talking about typically undergraduate perspectives, a way for undergraduates in the US to begin to learn about or think about law. And the assumption that was often made is that that necessarily would progress to graduate study, or at least it was to expose students, and if they enjoyed the field, they would then proceed to pursue a JD. What has happened in the US, and I believe the University of Arizona and my college have had a pretty significant hand in this, is we have highlighted the lesson from India and the rest of the world that it is more than possible to train undergraduates in law and legal reasoning. Now, that's actually a little against this theme of legal studies, right? The point is that there's nothing special about law, that it's limited to older and professional students. But at the same time, law in the US and around the world are, as this gathering notes, being pushed, being challenged to reconsider roots, connections. The global dimension is one piece of this. The understanding of the role of law in society, a traditional question posed by legal studies, has become more and more pervasive. So for example, in criminal law, we don't only look at training people to be prosecutors or defenders or judges and in the technicalities of the law, but also raise the larger questions. What is the role of law and legal systems in criminology or in crime? So I understand that's a slight offshoot from the question you asked, but it then is informed by this move to globalization. As you understand the larger law context of law, both in undergraduate and in graduate studies, then the relevance of different systems, the interrelationship among them, the complexity of our modern and connected world comes to the fore. And so those pieces, I think, have been beautifully illuminated in the last few years.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Over to Professor Panda.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for this. And please accept the greetings from KIIT School of Law. Well, the question is very interesting. As far as India is concerned, the changes that globalization has really brought. Just let us have a look to the things that have been there before globalization. Yes, I will not go much into the history, but I'll just look into the National Law School of India in the University of Bangalore. We started sometime during 87, 86. At the time, the founder and the founding Professor Madhav Menon, I remember he was seriously considering that we have to prepare our students undergraduate programs, particularly for the purpose of profession and the judiciary. India was struggling hard with very disordered law schools across the country. And legal education was not a take for many of the students who are from elite or brilliant background. And mostly the students who never used to get seat elsewhere, they would join to law schools. And legal education was not so jealously or passionately studied. And most of those particular people come from legal professional backgrounds, sons of the judges and the lawyers, they used to take into law schools and they studied. But the National Law School, Bangalore, the studies and the curriculum were something designed differently. For the first time with the focus how to create wonderful advocates and judges who are practice ready and who can really perform with a commitment for the nation, what it requires. That was the feeling at the time. But by the time the first batch was coming out from the law school, that was in 1992. And at the time already globalization has set in, the market economy. And the whole wonderful philosophy of Professor Madhav Menon and his team, preparing students, law graduates for sending them to litigation and the judiciary, really did not work out. And most of the people, students, they have found this wonderful space in most of the law firms across the country. Today you can see the best of the most of the law firms, the first batch of the students of Bangalore Law School, they were occupying. And it was a discovery for most of the law students across the country. Oh, this is another avenue that is available from litigation. And in India, there is not much of the space for paralegal or particularly thinking into the legal law firm business. And that's how the things were going on at the time. And by the time in 1992, when the particular batch has gone away, thereafter the other states, they started thinking of law schools across the country. And by 2000, we had another 4 law schools of national eminence: Valsad, Bhopal, and Kolkata. And all these particular law school students, now they have started focusing with a priority that will be going to corporate worlds, will be thinking of law firm. And the whole legal education scenario has changed. And somehow, yes, legal education gained some dignity. The dignity which was not there before 1987 for studying law. The law schools really brought in a separate type of scholarship, preparedness, learning, understanding, and going ahead. The law schools have really done a wonderful job. But the problem is, over these years, as I understand today, we have almost around 26 law schools, lesser law schools, and equally good law schools like Global Jindal and KIIT School of Law, where I am here at the moment. Quite eminently, they are situated in the country. But the question over here is, it's not only globalization. Globalization coupled along with the technology has brought many disruption. And the disruption, I tell you, is taking to something different. We're experiencing meta-level transformation everywhere. Learning is happening everywhere. And people have been learning, knowingly or unknowingly, consciously, because of the technology. And institutions still play, institutions do play a role, but I think they are losing their monopoly now. I think the teachers are losing their face. The learners are not choosy. If they decide to study under Marc or they want to study under Vishwas, they will reach there. They know the way out. And they don't need to go to an institution and slog around for the number of hours and schedules and start learning the things. So people can choose where, when, what, and with whom they want to learn. Further, they no longer need to comply with the demands of the group of the institution. And they can go and join, come and go and join anywhere they like. Join new networks, create new community, or learn different. And these particular things are something we need to understand. Now, the legal education also is not the same as it was before the globalization. After the globalization, legal studies are different. Globalization transport the social relationship. And technology compression of time and space facilitated denationalization of production, redistribution of regulatory authority beyond nation states. A shift is towards a market-driven or market-friendly legality. And this is in contrast to the, if I use the word, I don't know, jurisprudence. The whole science of law that we've been looking earlier is totally different. I need to look, keeping an eye on the market-friendly legality. And law schools, do they play the role? I think they're doing a paradoxical role. The emphasis is shifting not on the substance. It is shifting from the substance of legal education now to the form of the legal education. It is shifting from hierarchical model to transactional model. It's no more, you command me, I have to study the 60-odd subjects across the 5 years, then I have to go. No, I think we need to really think on that. And in India, legal education was largely controlled by the regulatory body, Bar Council of India. None of the law schools, not the university, has any control on the standard quality course outline of the legal education. that makes a stunted growth. The legal law schools are not enjoying the freedom of providing the knowledge, what they think that's going to matter for tomorrow's world. Even I have some particular resource, I can't offer this thing to my students because it's already loaded with the courses which may be redundant, which may be something which will not be appropriate to the students. So try to go globalization, legal education is largely substantiated by historical or normatively, predominantly a command model. Something is commanded, you have to do this thing, that's all. And I want a grade, you have to write this examination, you have to do this particular thing, and all these things going on. Today, probably for a moment, when I look to Coursera, I understand pretty well, this is a course very interesting me. This 30 hours I can go. I can read this course and I'm happy with this thing. And I learn, I feel satisfied. I'm offering myself to the test, to the market. You test me, I'm ready to answer you. And if you like me, hire me. If you don't like me, let us part ourselves with a goodbye, no issue. But my pleasure of learning is intact. So that is something that is happening. So we need to look from this particular digital landscape, new learning trajectory, and the vast disruption of the learning landscape need to be kept in mind. And it's totally a meta term. And the traditional legal education, let us spot ourselves with a goodbye.
Yes, Dr. Patricia, I think is in both rooms. So just say.
So this is my point. My point is probably we have been always under subjugation under the regulatory body, but the legal education, like Professor Marc was telling, independent subject like political science, economics, sociology, they have their own independent existence. They're controlled by a knowledge system. For a moment, I can very well appreciate why political science has a Nobel Prize, why law doesn't have a Nobel Prize. I'm not claiming about some particular prize, but I want that recognition should be there for the subject to grow independently. We'll be having many other questions on this particular thing, and I'll be asking these questions at the appropriate time. Thank you, Vishwas. This is it. This is what I want to do.
Thank you, Professor Panda. That brings us to a very interesting question. That is in terms of what is the role of legal studies in reorganizing the discipline of law? So how would our speakers want to kind of like to evaluate the role of legal studies in reorganizing law as discipline and profession in the global society? So, Marc, if you want to, attempt to answer this question. Fairly interesting question in terms of how has it at all reorganized the way we study law and how the profession is actually practiced?
Thank you. Let me offer a brief response. It's a great question, and also welcome my U.S. Dean colleague, Patricia Roberts, as well.
Thank you.
So the practice of law is changing. As Professor Panda noted, part of what's happening not only with globalization, but technology and changes in society is the questions that are posed both to those who've traditionally obtained either the LLB or the JD, but anyone who studies law, the questions are shifting. Think of whole categories of legal study, whole areas of practice that exist now and were essentially non-existent a decade ago. Cybersecurity, privacy, some of the aspects of global commerce. I didn't hear the prior session on family law, but from the little bit I heard about it, and given what my own colleagues work, I would be shocked if there weren't deep discussions of the changing nature of the family and relationships in light of these very same changes in society. So what I think this means is, and again, this goes in part to Professor Panda's comments, that what students studying law, what professors teaching law are engaged with is broader and different. And I think the legal studies is a fine framing. I mean, again, in the US context, that has a somewhat narrowing focus of thinking of undergraduate distance study, but from the framing that you're giving, and I think is relevant here, to be an effective lawyer, to understand legal institutions, to understand law, we now need to know much more about about the economics of society, sociology, the geography departments, the way they understand populations, movements. At the risk of commenting on developments in India from the US, and maybe that's always dangerous, look at, from a legal lens or from a legal studies lens, the fascinating evolution of the laws involving farm resources, the protests over the last several years, the recent proposed changes. We can look at that as a historian, we can look at that, as someone long interested in Indian politics, but if you put the legal lens on it, what were the laws, what drove them, what were the objectives, what are the objections, what's the history of the regulation of farming and the production of food resources in India, I think you can't understand that within the traditional mode of, well, what does the law say, and who would represent interests here, either whether it's a big agri interest or rural interest or community interest or village interest. You couldn't begin to understand the legal evolution in that context. So there's what I hope is a coherent and relevant, but India-specific example, driven, again, in part by globalization. That was what led to some of the proposed changes in markets and the concerns of functioning in global markets. You couldn't begin to understand without understanding technology and the data that now inform global food systems. And so I think that's just one illustration. You could pick almost any area and make the same point. It's made law more interesting. It's made the requirement that we think of law in a larger context essential, whether we're talking about undergraduate or JD, traditional LLB, or pre-law studies. It's relevant across the board.
Thank you, Marc. Given we have Professor Patricia Roberts. Patricia, what do you think in terms of, as legal studies, being able to kind of reorganize the discipline of law and even the profession to any extent, if at all?
Well, thank you so much for having me, and I appreciated the comments so far by my colleague, Dean Miller. And I have to agree that legal studies are changing. They're changing here, certainly. They're changing across the world, and we have no choice but to change them. Other countries have, of course, had the LLB in law for a long time while we went to a Juris Doctorate. But now increasingly, I think the United States is going to need to look at having an undergraduate focus in law. At my own institution, there are several hundred students in our university undergraduate school that have a pre-law interest. That's a need that's not being met by very many universities, at least here in the States. And so backing that up to the way that some of our international colleagues have, as you have with the LLB, makes a good deal of sense, because then I think that we're going to get to the point where graduate law programs in law are going to have to specialize more with the kinds of things that Dean Miller is talking about, mentioned, whether it's cybersecurity across the world or compliance issues, international compliance with trade. Look at the international nature of social media or cryptocurrencies and how they're going to change. And all of these things will bleed across countries. And we have to be prepared for that. So on the one hand, I think there have to be increased specializations in some graduate law programs, either following the LLB or even following the Juris Doctor with LLM master's programs, as many of us have, or SJDs. But then the other side of that is that there should be paths to expertise in law that do not require the Juris Doctor. And, here in the States, we call these masters of jurisprudence or masters of legal studies. And increasingly, I think, as I understand you're doing with LLBs, students in other areas of study need some legal expertise. So whether they're taking a master's program that helps them with healthcare compliance or cybersecurity, or even we've recently opened one in territorial law for the US territories. There are areas that students can study, not getting the full law degree because they don't intend to practice or maybe not sit for any sort of examination or apprenticeship globally. because they don't intend to practice. But by having the expertise, it will enrich their approach to problem solving in other fields. And it's going to become increasingly necessary to do that. That doesn't even address the access to justice issue. There are so many people worldwide who don't have access to attorneys when they do want to go to court. And so if we can do some training of people and licensing of people that is more modest than a full attorney or counselor at law, then there's a greater population available to serve those who need to get to the courts and need some representation, no matter where they are in the world.
Wonderful, Professor Patricia. I'll get back to you with more questions on that. Professor Panda, if you have a perspective on this.
I definitely, I must appreciate Patricia bringing this travel security, cross-country research and all those things. It's very interesting over here. And the question over here is, how do you evaluate the role of legal studies in reorganizing law and large discipline and profession in global society? This is the question. And for this particular question, my pointed answer is, changes to law and lawmaking precipitated by globalization have forced legal academics to rethink the substance, what we teach. But how do we educators account for the changes occasioned by similar forces to the way people learn? What does this learning revolution means for the manner in which law school practice education? Are we really preparing the students practice ready? If the profession is really taking the students what they have been repeating us, and you design the course, you institutionalize, we have offered the course, and if the students are practice ready. And I think over here, the legal studies is finding it difficult to flourish on its own because it's externally controlled by a regulatory body. It should be an independent study, right from UG, PG, and research. Without any particular regulation, as is being regulated by a professional body. So if that is happening, if we separate the legal education and the profession and allow the legal education to grow on its own by the academic yardsticks, and the philosophy of law can be developed pretty well. It is up to the profession to choose what they want, and somebody want to go to practice a profession, it's up to them. Consider what is learning. Simple question. The purpose of learning, what of learning, how learning happens, and what do the people learn best? Each question compels us to reflect on what we really believe are the goals. As a teacher, I'm speaking. I prefer strategies to learning when I offer. The answer that we select, whatever the answer that you select, the best of the mind, and we really put our passion, will inform the design. It is only going to inform me to design a program for offering to the students. Without mentioning the expectation of the learner. The learner is important over here. The world has changed today, and the equation of content takes priority. The individuals are responsible for their success are often measured against fixed criteria, the criteria which the erstwhile situation has managed. Combined and hierarchical models, learning schemes should be dynamic. Individuals follow instructions and respond to the demands of authorities. This is what really blocking the course. This is not taking the reach what the legal education would have reached. And success is not into the breadth and depth of assimilation of the learner. If this is the parameter by which we will be really giving legal education, probably will not be able to reach. I only just submit two more sentences over here. Distributed scheme of learning is important. The chief goal is personal growth. Learners should choose what they value and which they wish to learn. And individuals are intentionally driven to learn and to teach others. This is the generally intrinsic value. Success is contingent on achieving the individual's ambition. So with this particular point, I think this is how I wish the legal education is reorganizing itself. If not, the learners are going to find different trajectories. And these particular things are not professionally dealt with. Now we are preparing the students for the profession. They can really understand this issue. The issue is philosophical. The issue is different pedagogy, and it has to be done by legal educationists and academicians.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor. Thank you, Professor Panda. I mean, that raises a fairly interesting question that's come across. Given that we all recognize the role and importance of legal studies, and the fact that there is a difference in approach, in US being the JD model, in India being the 5-year integrated model, or the LLB, system of education that we have. Do you really think that we should take that positive step of making legal studies a prerequisite to legal education? Would the professional bodies, have no problem if we make legal studies a prerequisite to legal education? So, Marc, if you.
Yes, two things, and to keep the conversation moving. One is I would not make legal studies a prerequisite to licensed legal education, whether it's in the end, a 2 or 3 year degree in India followed by a 3-year LLB or a 5-year. I would not do that. I think we need to diversify the profession. I want to go back to what Patricia said, which is we are in a profession both in India and in the US, indeed around the world, that has tended to have a fairly narrow category of legal professional, whatever the prior degree in training, a narrow entry point to be able to deliver legal services. Compare this to nursing. At least in the US, there are, as best I can tell, 15 or 18 or 25 different kinds of nurses. There are dozens and dozens of kinds of health professionals who provide a very rich array of health services. Health services are far from perfect, but what they've understood, that entire profession or area, is that specific training, nurse practitioners, right, RNs, you can have health professionals, you can have health administrators. We have no equivalent in the US, but what Dean Roberts mentioned is actually happening, right? So we have 1,600 BA in law students and 450 online, mostly master students. But what's happened in Arizona is because of our degrees, the Arizona Supreme Court has approved an entirely new category of legal paraprofessionals. And it's specifically the product of our degrees. Utah has created a regulatory sandbox. California is looking at creating legal paraprofessionals. And again, why should an observer in India or around the world care what happens in the state of Arizona, lovely as the state of Arizona is? Because what this is in our larger conversation, Panda has raised, you've raised, that Dean Roberts raised, is this discussion of the change in what it means to be trained in law, to provide legal services, what is the legal profession. And the really big move here, again, driven in part by technology and in part by globalization, but in part by the need to provide, as Patricia Roberts noted, legal services to the vast number across the world who do not have access to them, is a radical expansion and decentralization of legal services. So if we made legal studies a requirement and made it longer and more expensive, we'd be moving in exactly the wrong direction. To have that option, as Jindal has created in India, absolutely, it lets people explore, it lets people get preliminary studies, they can then apply to other jobs in areas. RBA in law, no question, good, not indeed great developments, but to mandate, to make it more complex, to extend the track, to limit the kinds of alternative options that Professor Panda talked about in terms of broader training, I think that would not be a wise thing.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Over to Patricia.
Thank you. Well, I'm a big fan of what Dean Miller is doing in Arizona, and we all watch as they make changes. And I have to agree, we don't want to make the profession more exclusive. There is increasing movement here to diversify the profession from the majority members that have typically held the Juris Doctor. And we have a great need in the populations to have legal expertise and legal representation. So it doesn't make sense to make it harder to get the law degree, as Dean Miller was indicating. I think that we have to look at a variety of things. The regulatory bodies and even law schools themselves, I think, will differ as to whether they think that there should be, alternative pathways to assisting those in need of legal services. And certainly there have to be limits, and the devil's in the details, but there are things that people who do not have the ultimate degree, the Juris Doctor, can do to help those who need assistance, who would otherwise be going into the court systems alone. Or, we don't need Juris Doctors to give all the advice in a human resources department or in discussing international trade issues. We should expand the people who have an expertise in legal knowledge so that they can provide varying degrees of that advice to all of the populations that need it, whether they be businesses, corporations, or individuals.
Thank you, Professor Patricia. Professor Pandey?
Yeah, I still maintain the same thing. I was just telling about this particular legal education, its hierarchical tendencies, how it stunted the growth of legal education independently to grow on its own. Maybe we need to think of different trajectory to transnational models, transactional models. It is more about reflecting as individual academic and community scholars about how we can adapt our craft to the social and evolving trends manifesting around us. And how do I react to these particular trends? That is more important for us. And if we consider this particular, if we really come out of this particular hierarchical model, and we'll be able to take this particular society and the legal education as such in a transactional sphere, I think, yeah, profession is definitely one of our biggest receiver of the students, human resource that we create. But that's not the only area. There are many other areas the law scholars to contribute. So profession should not rule the legal education, and profession can demand standards. Okay, these are the things. You conduct your exam and take the exams and you qualify whatever you want. And definitely we will be happy to contribute as an academician, whatever the best you can contribute to the profession, but we should not be controlled by the profession. This is my submission.
Thank you, Professor Panda. Now, it's quite interesting that, of course, the prerequisite thing might be a little too much to be asking. So if that's not a possibility, can we really, is there scope for us to kind of sneak in legal studies as part of the legal education curriculum? Is there scope for legal studies to be, find a place in the curriculum of legal education? Professor Miller?
Well, so certainly there's room in the traditional pathways of legal education to add these larger questions of context. I think we're in agreement on that. Remember, in the US, other than the curriculum of the first year for our 3-year JD studies, there's almost infinite room. Now, as Patricia notes, there are reasons why we might want to start to specialize more, offer certificates or pathways as these particular areas of expertise develop. But we have vastly greater flexibility than has been true in the India higher ed system in terms of allowing these other contexts. I would make 2 points. First, I think we all agree that we shouldn't mandate legal studies before further advanced studies that allow licensure. But personally, I think every undergraduate in the United States should take at least one, if not several, classes in law. We live in a heavy legalized and regulated society, and that statement is as true for India and the US and China and Australia and Mexico and any country I've ever studied, lived in, or worked in. That has been true. And the trend, again, you can like this or not like it, you can criticize it, you can do research on it, but I think it's a fair description. And therefore, training, exposure to thinking about institutions, laws, regulation, the way society works, beyond the traditional introduction to government, the basic structures of government, the actual mechanisms, the roles of different people and institutions over time. I enthusiastically embrace the idea that that should be a fundamental part of higher education and education more broadly. From the standpoint in the US of the JD program, I think we have an obligation pushed by the very forces raised by Jindal Global University in this larger workshop and illustrated by JGU's growth to add more and more of context, of place. So I mentioned before, we shouldn't just be teaching criminal law and criminal procedure in the US, we should be teaching criminology and the role of lawyers in responding to crime. On the family law front, we don't just teach the laws of family dissolution and parental rights, and you have to teach the role of family in society and what the regulatory and social structures are that affect it. We can run this filter through business, through intellectual property, through these new and emerging areas of privacy and cyber relationships and trade, and it really applies across the board. So I think on both sides of the line, there's a lot more we can do, which don't make it more expensive and complicated, but do broaden what the concept of law and legal education is.
Thank you, Professor Miller. Professor Patricia?
Yes, well, I agree with my colleague from Arizona in that, as we said, mandating legal studies wouldn't be appropriate, but including and perhaps requiring some teaching of law and legal concepts in the undergraduate system or the higher education system outside of law schools does make a great deal of sense. And I think that, oftentimes the last time, at least in the US, students have talked about government and the rule of law is in high school. And that seems completely inappropriate because you want your society to continue to learn about the importance of the rule of law, how your particular legal system was created, why it was created the way it was. If we want the students who are learning in our higher education institutions to be part of the evolution of the rule of law in each of our countries, then they should know more about how it was created, why it was created the way it was. We're faced with a lot of challenges to our legal systems now because of the increased globalization, because of the fact that, for instance, if I'm going to have some sort of a website or a program that's then going to be in Europe, I've got regulatory issues in Europe that I wouldn't have here in the United States. So because of globalization, it's even more important that students in our higher education systems across the world understand the implications of law, why it was created, and how it needs to be further evolving. The one thing that we see here is, First Amendment issues. I think the higher education is facing some chilling of free speech here in the United States. And I think some of that is because we're not necessarily teaching our students the fundamentals of the First Amendment and why free speech is so important early on in their career, not just in law schools. You can't just teach these things in law schools, or else the only champions who can continue with protecting the rule of law or developing the rule of law are going to be lawyers. And it should be more than that. There should be more voices in the room. So that's what I would say about that. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. Professor Panda?
Yeah, thank you very much. I think the question again over here is the legal studies should be a prerequisite to legal education. And I think the answer is very clear. It should be. Legal education has our providing, and it has to be at every particular level, it should be offered. And I can't say better than what Dr. Marc, Miller, and Patricia has said. This is definitely a welcoming step. And we need to really see how this particular course can be integrated and it be offered. Maybe sometime back, we remember in India, the Supreme Court directed the UGC asking that you offer human rights course as a compulsory subject at every level. So also they asked environmental law should be offered at every level. I should say, looking to the question, probably we should make legal education, legal studies should be in certain components, should be given right from the very beginning, so that the course is well understood and it is required for everybody in the society. And I think I thank Marc and Patricia for doing giving the answers pretty well on this.
Thank you, Professor Panda. That brings me to my last question. So we've deliberated a lot about the legal studies, a way to kind of sneak it in to our curriculum. What is the future of legal studies? given the importance that we all envisage, we all see that it plays a major role in the way we construct and understand law. What is the future of legal studies, especially when it comes to the way education is imparted, legal education is imparted across the world? Over to Marc.
So I think legal studies is a growth area. I mean, we've all talked about why that should be, but it's in fact what we see. Let me return briefly to the Bachelor of Arts in Law, which we created at Arizona now 7 years ago. I mentioned that there are north of 1,600 majors, and U of A has about 50,000 students overall. So, pretty significant. We have 4 times as many undergraduates studying law as we have traditional JDs studying law. JD's been around here for 108 years. The BA's been around for 7 years. The demand for it was instantaneous. When we started that major with no advertising, no marketing, there were almost 200 students, 200, who stepped forward immediately and said, I want to study law. I understand the relevance of this. I understand I can't be a licensed attorney unless I go on and get the JD. I'm not confused for one moment. And they jumped in. That group in our domestic students, and I'll explain why I say that in a moment, has since we started been 60% female, 55% underrepresented minority, and 1/3 self-identify as first-generation students in the US. We offer that degree online. There are more than 350 students taking it online. Same diversity, except 2/3 self-identify as first generation. And we can offer it in partnership overseas. The ABA will not allow us to deliver the JD overseas. Patricia, I'm trying to break through that barrier. Happy to talk with you about that at some point. But right now, we literally couldn't deliver. I mean, deliver the JD courses at Jindal Global University, but the student who got the JD couldn't sit for a US bar. Therefore, the value of the degree for accessing the US market would. I will mention that the US has no nationality requirements for licensure. It will be good when India finally crosses that border and allows non-Indian citizens to be licensed and practice in India, but different issue than the one we're discussing right now. That BA allows us to do dual undergraduate degrees around the world. In effect, to illuminate precisely the concept of global studies, of legal studies that we've been discussing. So we, the U of A, have 450 students doing a dual degree in Qingdao, China, which will be at 500 in 2 years. We have a smaller but rapidly growing program in Hanoi. We have a smaller but sustained program of slightly different structure in Phnom Penh. If not for the complexity of the Indian legal market, I've talked with Raj Kumar about this over the years, and we would love to and believe, in light of the conversation we've just had about legal studies, it would be appropriate to do the same kind of thing, either with JGU or with a National Law University, Bangalore, or another elite institution. Professor Panda, perhaps we should talk about that as well. But that to me is a sign that what we're discussing is actually happening. We don't have to just imagine it. We can see it, and we see it in India, and we see it in the US. And if you look in Australia, you see it there. The countries I know closely are seeing exactly the move we're now discussing, which makes this conversation so timely and relevant. And again, thank you for including me in it.
Thank you, Professor Marc. Professor Patricia?
Thank you so much. This is one of my favorite questions because, as Marc knows, I started a podcast this year called Ed Up Legal. And the last question I ask of all my guests is, what is the future of legal education? What does it look like over the next decade? And I hear some consistent themes. One, it's going to have to get less expensive, at least here in the US. And one of the positives about exposing students in their undergraduate studies to law, I think is twofold. One, it will hopefully get some students who weren't thinking of law excited about the idea and interest them in a legal education. But then two, it will expose students who might think that they were interested in law, who then would undertake some significant expense trying to go to law school or going to law school and then leaving and not being satisfied with it. So it gives them a kind of a litmus test to see if a legal career is worthwhile for them. And also, do they need it to be the full JD, or can it just be something that provides them some legal expertise, like in a BA or in a certificate program or a master's, but not the full licensing? we at St. Mary's University School of Law in San Antonio, Texas, have the privilege of being approved by the American Bar Association as the first fully online JD degree. We will have our first class, thank you, Marc, first class of 25 students in the fall. We started this to be consistent with our mission of serving, in particular, underrepresented individuals in the profession and those in our South Texas area. At this point, I do not expect it's going to be a program that will provide the JD for international students, but I do see that that will happen in the future. That's not the intent of our small pilot program, but what it does show is that our licensing body here in the US, and I think increasingly, especially with Marc pushing and leading the trail across the world, there will be more online delivery of legal education, whether it is the kinds of tangential programs to the JD that we're talking about, or dual degree programs, as Marc has mentioned. So there's going to be continued diversification in the delivery models, not only in the product, the outcomes, but also in how people can access that education. We're very new at this. As I said, it's the first one in the US. It'll be a 4-year part-time program, but our applications are 5 times higher right now than they were this time last year with an in-person part-time program. It's certainly going to be meeting a need. And I say to people, while we might be the first, we won't be the last. There will be other US law schools and other law schools across the world who find that this is a way to increase access to legal education and the profession, and will be engaging in this kind of delivery model.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Professor Panda?
Yeah, it's very interesting. I'll tell you, I do also agree with what my predecessor speakers have spoken. Legal studies are happening everywhere, every time, but in different shapes. But time has come. Legal studies need to be utilized at every level by its own calling. It should be branded, yes, it's legal studies. And that should happen, independent of the age of regulators. But for a discipline of learning and contributing to society, what the learner-centered society wishes to acquaint and expertise with. Not something we want to drag and we want to. That particular thing should go out. It should be free and learners would understand what exactly, how he is going to contribute. And that's how the legal studies should be internalized and every particular, and if that is going to happen, the law really can contribute at every particular position, wherever it is. Thank you very much. And I must thank Rajkumar for giving this wonderful opportunity, the Vice Chancellor. Thanks, Marc and Patricia.
Thank you, everyone, for that interesting session. But we're not done yet. It might be 9 p.m. Out here in India, and Raj is making me work late in the night. So Raj, I deserve a dinner when I come back to campus. So, but having said that, we have an interesting set of questions from the audience, and thank you for watching us live from wherever you're coming from. And one very, very interesting question that kind of
call me, so I'm here.
I called you primarily because you need to get me a dinner. So a very interesting question from one of the audiences is when we study, when we are looking at legal studies, and more specifically, which might usually be context heavy, right? So if you're probably doing legal studies in US, might largely be reflecting at the context in North America. But how do you bridge this gap, especially in a globalized environment when what decision that is made in one part of the world has an impact in the other part of the world? Is there scope for legal studies to kind of embrace the global South voice as well, while trying to study maybe in the Western world, somewhere in North America, or maybe Australia? Is there a possibility for us to embrace, different voices when we are into legal studies? So anyone, Marc?
I'll give a quick answer and make sure there's short answers and time to respond. A little over 20 years ago, a group tried to start a US style English language law school to teach US law in China, city of Shenzhen. And it was well funded and it was led by very prominent US academic leaders. And they satisfied the requirements of the American Bar Association, the relevant council, the relevant division, and twice that council denied accreditation to that law school. In English, teaching US law, right? Most people, I think it is fair to say, thought that law school went up in a puff of smoke because its whole purpose was to be a licensed US law school in China. In fact, it continues to thrive. So it turns out that the underlying value was both studying English, but also studying US law. And those students on the whole are not coming to the US to go to St. Mary's or Arizona and get the JD. On the whole, they're going to work in Chinese companies, in government, in nonprofits, working throughout East and Southeast Asia. And it's the knowledge of a comparative legal system. It's the knowledge of legal studies more generally that has created value. The reason we have 450 students in China, the reason we get great students coming from Jindal to come and get higher degrees is because I think we overstate the assumption that legal systems are all local, that laws are all local. And in fact, even before this turn to legal studies, some of the, not just global law, but some of the comparative dimensions, some of the similarities in the regulatory and legalized move around the world across areas has made, in fact, the study of other systems commonplace, logical, sensible, and students have understood this first.
Yeah, thanks, Marc, for that intervention. Patricia or Professor Panda, if you have anything to comment on this.
I think the only thing I would add is that increasingly, because of the growth of online education, for those international attorneys, those studying legal studies globally, who want to learn about another system, it's much easier now. Many of the US law schools have LLM programs in American legal studies. And so I think it's much more prevalent now. It's much more easily delivered so that the people can stay in their home countries. And I am confident there are opportunities like that out there for our own students from the US who want to learn another country's system. But I think that would be very based on employment, because the students here are likely to learn what they need to work here. But if they are employed, say, and doing a lot of work with India, then the same sort of degree would be helpful to them if they could learn about the Indian legal system. But it's very interesting to hear Marc's description of the school that started. I think when I heard the question, what I was envisioning was a school where a student could learn about multiple legal systems from across the globe and try to integrate that information into what it is they then explore. I'm thinking like a comparative law school, and I don't know of a law school like that, and I wonder what the ultimate interest and utility in such a law school would be. It would, I guess, depend on what the focus of the curriculum was.
Thank you, Professor Panda.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. We have another interesting question, and that is more from the point of view of professors who are involved in teaching law, but are trying to kind of integrate legal studies as part of their larger discussion. Is there a need for us to kind of change the pedagogy? Do we need to kind of evolve new tools to kind of impart legal studies as part of our legal education?
Again, I'm happy to quickly respond. Just two quick points. One is there's been a very heavy trend in the US to hiring JD PhDs into academic positions. So they bring that cross-disciplinary training and focus. And the second is this is happening organically. I think what we've talked about is how legal education is reflecting a larger change in the world around us. We don't have to go convince others. We have to adapt to the times. I think Patricia's been right to heavily emphasize the use of digital technologies and the beautiful program that St. Mary's is doing to lead the way in the JD to illustrate that there really is no barrier. You have to learn different skills. You have to learn to deliver in different ways. There's different kinds of student support. I don't want to trivialize the difference of Zoom and online interactions and in person, but that they absolutely not only can be overcome, but they can swing open doors to precisely the kind of legal studies we've been discussing here.
Thank you, Marc. Any comments? Another very interesting question before I close the session is it's a question from a student saying that if I am a student of law and legal studies is not in any way heavily integrated in my legal education, how do I actually go about getting a sense of how this plays out if I'm trying to integrate legal studies into my reading? Very interesting question, yeah.
I think any of us could answer it in part. We have, right? Which is to begin to take classes that they should be available outside of full degree programs. And, Patricia mentioned master's degrees or advanced degrees, but also you could have certificates. You could, if you talk to an advisor in most academic settings and say, I'm interested in law or legal studies, I'm not sure I want to be a lawyer, I'm not sure I want to pursue a full LLB, then you could think of a couple of classes, not just an overview of the legal system, but it might be one on, constitutional law or one on family law. It might be, if you look at these several areas, you'll get a sense of how the legal and regulatory systems work and whether it's interesting, or you can get a basic foundation that might help you. And so I think there are very few great universities that wouldn't provide the opportunity, whether there's a formal program or not, for an undergraduate student to begin to explore this area. If they're aware of it, they're 3 steps down the road. And as I've suggested, the level of awareness of the importance of law is quite pervasive. We don't have to convince people of this. We have to help provide the opportunity for those who want to study.
Thank you, Marc. Any comments from anyone?
I would just encourage students to be proactive, as Marc indicated, and if their institution doesn't already allow that kind of cross-registration in different departments, then they should suggest that maybe that's something that should be available. Or one thing I find very interesting is a lot of undergraduate students here don't even think to go sit in on a law class, even though the law school is on the same campus. So I think that there are opportunities to do that, but a student should talk to their advisor or be proactive, talk to other professors that are teaching the types of subjects they would like to integrate into their existing degree program.
Thank you, Professor Patricia. Thank you, Marc. Thank you, Professor Panda. We had a wonderful discussion, and I hope this encourages more discussion on legal studies and legal education.